Highlands and lochs. Of course, this man, I don't know if you can see in the back row, you know, the man with the kilt, the bagpipe. And I'm quite certain people would come along with Braveheart, the film, This is Scotland. Or they are against the English, you know, rebel against it. And of course, Nessie, should not forget Nessie. And I'm not sure if I ask you to add more, but you would do in a classroom. You would do say, well, come along with your ideas. What are your concepts of Scotland and Scottish culture? The big question arises, what is it? What is Scottish culture, actually? And I would like to begin the myth of Scotland. If you look at the map, you will just see here the Highlands, the Isles, Orkney, even Shetlands, almost Norway, and Lowlands with the big cities, Glasgow and Edinburgh. Very different in history. Yes, and people say, according to that already, you question Scotland, identity, cultural identity, big question mark. That's how I would open a lesson. That's how I would like to open our talk. Really questioning, what is it? What are we talking? If we look at this, of course, we cannot forget history, Scottish identity. Here we have the historian, and we've heard about it. And we come to some major facts. Again, we have the Highlands, the Isles, the Lowlands, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and we have 3 languages connected. Don't ask me, I cannot read them, only the English. But you will hear later on something about the Lowlands, actually not Scots, just the same, but different to our ears anyhow, and Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, later on. Because my talk will be basically about, I said, Scottish identity, cultural identity, and have a look at some historical facts. We will have a short glimpse, you're all familiar with it. But again, keep in mind, I have your students in mind, your lessons in mind. And I think that it's mighty important to know some aspects. And then we carry on looking at the so-called Scottish Renaissance, which was a literary movement in the beginning of the 20th century, and it had a huge impact on Scottish literature, as well as the big question, who are they? What is the Scottish identity or cultural identity? That's what I want to talk about, tell you about. Okay, so let's, excuse me, I may just sit down for a while. Here are the historical background, some aspects. I mean, this is really most familiar to you. Of course, we have to begin with the Celts. Not to forget the Picts, they always come up as well, but we stick to the Celts. And of course, it has a huge impact on the Scottish, or you hear at least a lot about it, again and again, the Scottish identity as such. For example, as mentioned, the Scottish Gaelic language. Can you hear me when I'm sitting? Is that okay? Then we have, of course, William. Well, we have then later on the Wallace, William Wallace, well known through this film Braveheart, but of course, as you all know, it's a complete fiction. I mean, it's the only combination. But yet, don't forget, we're talking about 3 concepts of Scotland. And I think this film has put a huge impact on our concept of Scotland. Not being Scottish, not being in Scotland. But those stereotypes are not so far away from our concepts. Yes, then we have the Union of the Crowns, of course. Yes, All the Germans know that from Maria Stuart, the famous drama. Yeah, that's the thing. And you have this James Stuart became then the King of England and Scotland. And we have heard a lot about already the 18th century and the Union, the Treaty of the Union. 18th century, I think, was hugely important for many reasons. We've heard a lot about it already through your talk about Humphrey Clinton. We had the Jacobite uprising in the Highlands, Bonnie Prince Charlie. Wherever you are in Scotland, you will hear about it. So again, we have a concept, it's ideas. I mean, it's a historical fact, but what do people make about it, about their own identity? And in the 18th century, of course, we also have, as a result of that, the Dress Act, that the Highlands were not allowed to wear their kilts anymore. And we have, of course, Robert Burns, coming up as a national bard. And he came along with a romantic concept of the sublime and the beautiful, Highland culture. If you come to think about it, we have been talking about so far with all these historical facts a lot about the Highlands. Yeah, it's only, and yeah. Now, of course, 18th century has been mentioned, Scottish Enlightenment, hugely important as also for the Scottish culture as such, for their own identity. Wow, we are learned people, and they are, as you will notice when you meet them, as you all have done as far as I know. Yes, but actually, in the 18th century, very few people actually traveled to Scotland. It was known as a romantic concept, but it was not actually very attractive. You know, it was a place wild, islands, poor, we've heard, people would not go there. 19th century, we come to this very famous, or well-known to Sir Walter Scott and his novels. Again, he created a huge impact on this concept. What is Scottish culture? All these figures, yeah, the Waverley novels and so on. And of course, he helped the king come to Edinburgh. So this was in 1822. It was called the King's Jaunt. And I have on your handout a first paper. John People, it's called, wrote about this visit. I mean, the king appeared in the kilt, which was actually forbidden. And it was the first time a monarch actually came to Scotland, set foot on Scotland for 170 years. So it was huge. It was very, very important for Scotland. But again, to this concept, you know, and this man said, John Peebles, on your handout, it just part, I quote, Scotland could not be the same again once it was over. A bogus tartan caricature of itself had been drawn and accepted even by those who mocked it. Walter Scott's certification continued to seduce his countrymen. It gave them a picturesque national identity. It united lowland and borderer as one nation with a diminishing Gaelic minority. This costume and history might now be honorably assumed by all. Aha, so we all of a sudden, the Scots themselves may identify with certain aspects. You notice it's just a lot of mirroring here. Yeah? Historical facts and what let's face. So this few glimpses at the history show you that it is a multi-facial concept we meet here. But one thing is a common denominator. We are against the English. Well, we have already heard something about Britishness and Englishness, not the same, as you all know. But this is a tricky thing. I don't want to get into it. It's a big concept, but it's very important till today, as you probably know. As we have already heard, if you have an identity, you would actually need the other. And here they are, the other are the English. We are not like the English. And I'm sure you've heard that a lot, many, many, many times. You know that. But Scottish, as you know from historical facts, part of Great Britain since the Treaty of the Union. It can be, Scotland can be described to be in bed with an elephant. So you are part of it. The English perspective is they deny Scottish nationhood and their stereotypes of the Scottish being mean and thrift, good with money, their beautiful countryside. You could see that during the Brexit, all the Londoners went to Scotland, you know, to discover the beautiful countryside. So look at it by now. There are one identification, one point, that is we are not English. But then in the 20th century, it happened. We come to the very last point. As you all know, the devolution, the referendum in 1997, and Tony Blair accepted the cultural change. So Scotland actually got some kind of independence and a national identity. Well, it had already, actually. It's not gone, but it was in a way a politically grounded, actually. I have one paper just showing what the Scottish Parliament is now able to do, and you can just read it. And again, I have in mind it's the classroom I'm talking about here, but I think devolution might be actually on this whole struggle for independence might be a very interesting topic to deal in schools, depending what kind of students you've got. Because, and of course, I think that's a very fascinating topic to discuss identity in a classroom. All these mirrors we have just been mentioning so far, you can do in the classroom as well. And I'm sure in German classroom with you. So German students, you have a lot of response. And that's why I put it in, you know, devolution would be possible, would be a possible aspect to deal with for a series of lessons. Okay, let's come back to history, and now we are in the 20th century. Before in 20th century, we have Scotland being very successful, smart, high-tech Scotland. And tourism is a huge factor of this successfulness. And of course, we have the reinforcement of all the stereotypes just mentioned through the film industry and so on. That's where we are. And we have, so I have to look through all my notes here. So I've just sum up before we go on and to look at the Scottish Renaissance. The Scottish identity, idea of Scottish identity does not really fit. Scotland is a rather stateless nation, if you want. Yeah, always threatened by the English. And I come along, I'm not a historian myself, but many of sociologists and so on. Christopher Harvey said, Scotland belongs to the Europe of regions. It's rather than nations. So it is actually an entity in its own rights. And as you probably know, in Scotland, they have a very strong sense of being European. They did not accept, they didn't want to, they wanted to remain. They didn't want to be, step out of the European Union. On my handout, I have on the pages 1 till 3, I have various papers which you could possibly use in the classroom discussing actually identity or cultural identity, and Britishness. If one paper is also about Britishness, which I thought might be a good idea. But we come to the point here that We talk here of special Scottishness as a set of ideas, beliefs, connected with some kind of myth, or to give us the impression of thinking nationally. With Niethammer said, he spoke of Identitätsbausätze, so a patchwork of identities. And I think that's very suitable for Scotland in many ways. Or David McCrone said in Understanding Scotland, is also on your handout number 3. He spoke of, you might call it a pick and mix identity, in which we identities lightly and change them according to circumstances. And I think that's, again, the historical aspect. You have an identity, but you adopt circumstances. But you nevertheless, you are different nevertheless. But what you are might be historically a different thing. So that's where we are here. A fluid multi-concept of Scottish cultural identity, changeable in the course of her history, yet distinct of not being English. And with a clear reference to her own cultural history, and this finds its expression in the 3 languages you've just seen, and they have very much sort of be at the center of the so-called Scottish Renaissance. Now, what is the Scottish Renaissance? Oops, go back. It began the beginning of the 20th century, and the Irish literary revival had impressed the Scotsman at the turn of the century. And so there was a local need not to be parochial. I thought about provincial a minute ago, but parochial is a different word. It's a completely different word. Anyhow, McDermott, the leading figure of the movement. The movement was between 1910 to 1950, roughly. Stressed this point by insisting that true internationalism could not exist without small nations. You are again regions, which I've just said. Yeah. So, and Roger Wharton, a book, recommend the literature of Scotland, says, I quote, if the Renaissance exists at all, however, its most developed expression has been achieved in literature as writers have sought to express themselves in a more modern Scotland. They have felt the need to remark an understanding of their own present nature and past history. And no 2 writers have taken the same route. But they had a huge impact until today. I will come to that. It had particularly a revival of Gaelic and Scots folklore and regional myth until today. And as the handout 4, you have McDermott in a letter. And he says, claims, Scotland is a separate and very different country from England. That Scotland has an independent literary tradition, yet it been ignored by many countries since, according to him, the English tradition aims to eliminate and assimilate Scottish standards completely to English. And he criticized the government agency like the Arts Council, the British Council, etc., to have pursued this policy. You will hear this argument again and again nowadays still. It's very prominent, or at least I've heard it a few times. But that was a huge motivation. And out of this Scottish Renaissance, that movement, so-called, actually a lot of new publishing houses existed, new magazines, and so on. Whereas before, and still are, most of them are in London. But here in Scotland, particularly in Edinburgh, but I think also in Glasgow, a lot of, many, usually very small publishing houses open close again. But it was a huge, very lively world, but still is. Now, I've mentioned the Hugh McDermott, and you cannot do without him. And and I probably need now Hannah's help because I have him speak and read his Watergall. And there you hear his it's called Lowlands, call it Lowlands. It's a kind of synthetic. It's not Scots as such. Scots as such is a language in its own right, or languages in its own right. There are various kinds of Scots. It's a bit like Middle English, different, influenced by the Angles, and so on.
What the poem is about, I'm going to read you one or two very short poems in Scots, which will be quite unintelligible, I think, to all of you, unless I explain them. The Watergall. A Watergall is a broken rainbow, a broken shaft of a rainbow that you can see sometimes between clouds. Not a complete arc, but the broken shaft of the rainbow. And this poem says, one wet early evening in the sheep shearing season, I saw that occasional or rare thing, the broken shaft of a rainbow with its trembling light beyond the downpour of the rain. And I thought of the last wild look you gave before you died. The next two lines are very difficult idiom. The skylark's nest was dark and desolate. My heart was too. But I have thought of that foolish light ever since then, and I think that perhaps at last I know what your look meant then. Now, in Scots, in my Scots, that reads this way. A week voor necht of the outrummel, I saw yon enteren thing, a watergall with its shittering licht, ayont the yonding, and I thought of the last wild look you gied before you did. There was nae reek of the laverik's hoose that night, and nae mine, but I hae thought of that foolish licht ever since syne, and I think that maybe at last I ken what your look meant then.
Okay, here is the man again, and if you've got an impression of this language, I think it's not so difficult to follow for us Germans, actually, because you have a lot of these guttural sounds, and some of the words are very simple, well, not similar, but you can guess. Hugh McDermott, I mean, he was obviously a very prominent figure as such, and his aims were to revive and modernize Scottish literature by reclaiming Scots as a serious literary language. I mean, as I said, he created his own language, in a way, his own language, but Scots as such exists. And he encouraged that, and it's still around. I mean, people writing in Scots ever since. And he's absolutely against this sentimentalism, this especially reductive Burns culture. 18th century Robert Burns and all the images of the Romanticism, very much against it, and to forge a Scottish modernism with international ambitions and using experimental forms, wide cultural reference to revalue national identity. He had a huge impact on writers, seen as a central catalyst of the Scottish Renaissance, and he created new words, even, in its vernacular literary expressions, influenced the 20th century Scottish poets, novelists, everyone in that literary world. And he provoked debate about nationalism, politics, poetic method, and that also shaped later generations. His major work, the very long poem, A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle, it's about 2,685 lines, really a very long poem. It's structured in multiple sections, showcasing a variety of poetic forms and styles, reflecting McDermott's engagement with contemporary intellectual movements. Central to the poem is the figure of the village drunk man, who symbolizes both the poet's personal journey and the broader Scottish experience. Here we're talking about identity. It's a piece you could use for that. The poem speaker lies beside a thistle and launches into wide-ranging reflections on Scotland's culture, language, politics, history, and spiritual condition. The thistle functions as an emblem of Scottish prickliness. We've already heard about a man in Humphrey Clinker who's also characterized with his prickliness, resilience, and potential regeneration. And that's the Scottish Renaissance regeneration to come along. Yeah, that's so far too. You madam could say much more about it, but shorten that. Next point I want to mention is writers writing in Scots. You have Robert Garrioch, Sidney Goodness-Smith, and many others. And I cannot read it to you anyhow, but what I have is here's a little booklet which I let go through of Robert Garrioch and William MacLean. I will hear about it. Gaelic, Scottish, and English. So you have the same. Most of the time, Scottish writers writing in Scots actually also provide an English version, as they do if they're writing Gaelic, they write an English version. Otherwise, most people cannot read it. Let's just let it go through. So I just want to stress that Scots is as a language since the of McDermott, a literary language, and it's actually also been encouraged by the Scottish Parliament. You know, the Makars, they usually have once or every 4 years, I think it is. They actually say the Makar is Scotland's national poet. A position established in 1904. Edwin Morgan was the first one to promote poetry, literature, and the languages, Scots and Gaelic. That's where it comes from. So it's very prominent in today's Scotland still. Now let's come to the very important person as well. It's Thorley MacLean. We have now the Gaelic part. Thorley MacLean is well known till today. He was born in 1911 and died in 1996. And it was a pleasure to see him reading, and you will hear. We don't think we see him reading, but you can hear his voice. And even if you do not understand a word, these Gaelic words, they seem to be a bit like waves, coming over you. I hope you will have the same experience. You will hear the poem reading.
Just a sec, I need to refresh.
Yeah, a poem in a minute. Dogs and Wolves, it's called. Very famous poem, and he reads them. He will explain. School of Scottish Studies, another very famous place. Have you shown this night? There, no, I work there.
I'm going to pick poems here and there, without any reference to chronology. I'll tell you their period, or roughly their period, but I am not going to keep necessarily to chronology at all. Now, I read translations, so the translations I read are my own translations. And, well, whether they are poems in their own right is a matter of opinion. the translations. Now, I read the English translations first because I think that gives more of a chance to people who don't know Gaelic. I'll read a poem that, which is really a dream poem to begin with. It was made in December 1939 in rather tragic circumstances, or what I thought were very tragic circumstances. And as some people have said, though some people have said it is a poem about poetry, it isn't at all. I'll read it. Dogs and Wolves, that's the English title. Across eternity, across its snows, I see my unwritten poems. I see the spoor of their paws dappling the untroubled whiteness of the snow. Bristles raging, bloody tongued, lean greyhounds and wolves leaping over the top of the dikes, running under the shade of the trees of the wilderness, taking the defile of narrow glens, making for the steepness of windy mountains, their baying yells shrieking across the hard barenesses of the terrible times, their everlasting barking in my ears, their onrush seizing my mind, career of wolves and eerie dogs, swift in pursuit of the quarry, through the forests without veering, over the mountain tops without shearing, the mild mad dogs of poetry, wolves in chase of beauty, beauty of soul and face, a white deer over hills and plains, the deer of your gentle beloved beauty, a hunt without halt, without respite. The Gaelic is Matin Ali. Harnashiariach Karashneachke, Hime Maganyo Yechtje, Hime Loroken and Spoke, Brechke, Gilahoim nach Andrechke, Kalakar Volle, Chenga Falaker, Hulas, Matin Ali, Leem, Har Mullichen and Gara, Rufus Gal and Grun Fasel, a Gal Konk, Nung Glam, Shiru Kashet Nung Viam, a langan galanach a shianel, har loman croed an aun kianel, and hortig vivan na machloasen, and jaun ri a gal ma boagen, reis na matus na honi orgalt, loa her torach gan iagich, Trna cailtin gan iarag, har mullich na mewn gan hiarag, con hiwn y cwych na bardach, matin ar tor na haliach, Ach gan namas yn ydyn fiag gal har fewn as rwyntyn, fiag da foich y cwn y gylach, fiag gan sgwrch gan uchag. Now, it was December 1939. It was written in very strange and rather in what I thought was terrible circumstances. I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning and wrote down the whole thing without changing a line, or hardly, without changing a line afterwards. This is a little poem of the 30s too.
Stop here. It's a full range of. It gives an idea of Gaelic as. One gospel, I don't understand the word, but it gives an impression of this world of Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, I must say. And and he had again, it was very well known, particularly his poems to Aimia. It's a sequence mixing love and political commitment. His Hullig, published in 1954, short, widely anthologized poem about a depopulated village central to his reputation outside of Gaelic circles. I mean, and his influence and legacy is till today very strongly felt as a central figure in the Gaelic literary renaissance. And you still have Gaelic writers. And I would like to stress another one, Ian Crichton Smith, of course. He's a very prominent writer, and I do not have the example here, but I recommend his poems and particularly short stories. for the classroom. Very good. I've got one example here, also with didactic information called the wedding, I think. But there's also another short story, the telegram. They're fantastic short stories which can be used in the classroom. And they are all a lot about should not forget it here. Put some notes. It's these novels. Consider the Lilies. I don't know if some of you've read it. It's not a huge book, but it's easily read. But it really brings across this moment of dial and clearances as another factor of the 19th century. And you can literally feel that this poor woman who has to leave this house, as you probably all know, another the Crofters had to leave because the sheep had returned to come over and replace them, basically. For reasons. And, so Ian Crichton Smith writes in English and Gaelic, and he died in 1998, and he also translated many poems. Now I come to English. That's probably the most accessible part of the English Renaissance of the poets. And we have here, well, Norm MacCaig. You cannot leave this room without having met Norm MacCaig since started to met him. And George Bruce, both Norm MacCaig and George Bruce lived in Edinburgh, but George Mackay Brown from Orkney, a very well-known writer as well. And of course, Edwin Morgan representing Glasgow sonnets and so on. He was the first Makar in 2004, or quite rightly was laureate. At the moment, I just name the other Makars at this moment because they were very prominent figures, of course, of the literary world, like Liz Lockett and Jackie Kay, Kathleen Jamie, and today it's Peter Mackay.
Very nice.
Yes,
He taught here.
he taught here, and I've got your book. It's over there because he's at the moment at the Makar. Now I'll come back to Edwin Morgan. He's widely regarded as one of the leading Scottish poets of the 20th century. Glasgow poet laureate and so on. I do not go on into this. Yes, both talks were about Edwin Morgan most of the time. So if you have a look at that, they're still on YouTube. You will hear more about Edwin Morgan. Highly recommended, very, very good poems, very easy, very, very experimental as well. But let me come to Norman MacCaig. Norman MacCaig, born in 1910, died in 1976. I met the man. I wrote my PhD, my first degree paper on his work, and my PhD, and I was very lucky to have 3 interviews. I've met him many, many times. I couldn't say we have become more like friends really in the course of the years. I wrote a monograph of his work, about his 600 poems, and then just came along with collected poems by his son, Ewan MacCaig, after his death. He was a recipient of the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry, as was Edwin Morgan. And his books, as Edwin Morgan's books, are in school books across Britain, all over the world. So it's really well known, not in Germany, I must say, not internationally, but in Scotland and Britain. Yeah, and after all this, of course, he also wanted a poem, and now it's easier.
Aunt Julia spoke Gaelic very loud and very fast. I couldn't answer her. I couldn't understand her. She wore men's boots when she wore any. I can see her strong foot stained with peat paddling the treadle of the spinning wheel, while her right hand drew yarn marvellously out of the air. Hers was the only house where I've lain at night in the absolute darkness of a box bed, listening to crickets, being friendly. She was buckets and water flouncing into them. She was winds pouring wetly round house ends. She was brown eggs, black skirts, and a keeper of threepenny bits in a teapot. Aunt Julia spoke Gaelic very loud and very fast. By the time I had learned a little, she lay silenced in the absolute black of a sandy grave at Luscantire. But I hear her still, welcoming me with a seagull's voice across 100 yards of peat scrapes and lazy beds, and getting angry with so many questions unanswered. I'm sure.
Yeah, you can possibly imagine this young boy, he did not have any Gaelic, and meeting this aunt on Scalpe out of Hebrides, speaking Gaelic all the time, and his uneasiness in his lonely bed, listening to crickets, being friendly. Yes, that's Norman McCaig. I think his terms are very accessible, and you can deal with them in the classroom, I would imagine. No, I've done that from experience with that. Poor students could not avoid it, you know. Anyhow, Norman McCaig actually is born in Edinburgh, but he says his Gaelic ancestry, his mother came from the Outer Hebrides, made him consider himself a Gael, and he called himself a second generation townie. And he always went up to Ascent. He loved fishing in the northwest of Scotland. And he said Ali Bain actually said it was his spiritual home. He was actually, although I was born in Edinburgh, he actually writes a lot about Edinburgh, about Edinburgh. But he's actually all that. So we have here a figure who is actually in both worlds, if you want, in the London. We come back to that. I think I should finish my talk here. Just have me quickly, I would like to refer to Robert Crawford, is the present day a writer. You have this poem and the next and another one in your handout with the translation even. I think translation exercise might be quite interesting also to do in the classroom, you know, just for a tricky bit. And just his present day, and so which we know normally, okay, all these people are dead, but this is present day writer. Yeah, present day writers as such, they have out from this Scottish Renaissance, they are experimenting. We have Robert Crawford, Cal and Duffy, we have already mentioned, Don Patterson, generation before, Liz Lockett, big names. It's a very lively community in Scotland. Talking about identity or cultural identity, here we have a very modern, very vivid awareness of being Scottish, not English, but all the rest is depending on the circumstances, etc. It's a mixed picture of identity based on history, based on personal experience. My last bit, of course, is just suggested reading. I have some links. The Scottish Poetry Library is very helpful. They have actually themes and whatsoever. You can actually pick and choose what you want if you want to deal with poetry. I know it's not always very welcomed in the classroom, but I think if you embedded it with other aspects of identity and so on, it can also be quite interesting. Also, maybe with some kind of creative writing. Yeah. I would like to add there is in last year's presentations, he mentioned the link ScottishBookTrust.com. And in that, they have even a competition of 50 words. German students in the English classroom can do 50 words, a text of 50 words, and have competition at the moment on wellies. You know, so maybe you want to join in as teachers, you know, and just to give you an idea. Yes, literature, I just mentioned Robert Watson, but they have there's plenty of Robert Crawford, Marshall Walker, and so on. Just, yeah, the usual books to look up. Think I have something prepared for you there. I thought dealing with Scotland in the classroom, you may have year 9 and 10. I've just heard that the curriculum in Latin actually stresses Scotland more than it has done in the past. So we may want to plan a visit to Scotland or deal with books and so on. But I have also more series of lessons in the year 11, 12, and you have to do Macbeth or the part of Macbeth. If, of course, Shakespeare, you can include that with Scotland, and I've done it. It's actually very, very successful because then it's not so dangling in the air, with this Macbeth and the Shakespeare, difficult Shakespeare. It's how you have Scotland and Ireland, of course, always a good thing to do. Northern Ireland or Ireland as such, maybe Northern Ireland depends. Or you have the regions as I've done, which is a lot to do. Or you deal with poetry as such. I've mentioned some ideas. Now I have 5 minutes more. Thank you for your attention.